So good morning, Gabe. I just thanked you for carving out some time, and I appreciate it in advance of the recording. I haven't spent any time with you in the recent past. Last Saturday, we took our walk, but on a recorded session. And I sent you something last night to think about, and just wanted to dive in any direction you like. What's been occurring to you since we talked, and what your thoughts are?
I think starting with your syllabus there of silence was a good one.
Gonna read that?
Yeah, let me see here. It said, the disease of mentally obsessive thinking is contagious and carried not by bacteria or viruses, but toxic silence. When thoughtful but not always welcome words could help, our vocal conversation that helps reinforce the sick thoughtlessness of this induced mental state. The imposition of this addiction is not a state of mind, but of a brain that has been misused and abused as though it is the creator of reality and truth. So I think that first there, that's contagious through the silence.
Well, and I'm suggesting this toxic silence, meaning it points when things could be said that could be valuable to ears that aren't even welcoming it or listening.
Right.
That sort of discomforting time when you know that somebody is really rejecting and opposing and really drowning in there. It's like the people who drown and lifeguards don't get near them because they know they're going to drown them with them. So they throw them that orange buoy on a rope so that they can save them and not drown with them. And so I think the qualification there is to see that at moments where thoughtful, rather than patting people on the back and saying it's going to be okay if it's not now, the practice of something going to be okay is the suggestion that it's absolutely not now. Why would we wait to go there to get it okay, then actually begin to reckon with the okayness or not okayness in the present? And face that rather than say, oh, it's going to be okay. Just continue doing whatever you're doing that's causing it and you'll get better. I mean, that may in some patchwork quilt seal a few of the leaks, but I think it's not recognizing in our case that the boat's already sunk and at the bottom of the ocean. It isn't a situation that we can bail water in because we're living as though we are what we think we are and only what we think we are to any degree that we're thinking obsessively. And I would say it's so common and popular. We have come to believe it's usual and normal, and it isn't any more than someone who is addicted and thinks the only thing they can do is heroin because it makes them feel good is actually doing the best thing they can do.
Well, I read it as what we've talked about briefly, I think, in the past is, and dealing with it out there in all our affairs is when something could be said, when clearly someone is not thinking aligned with reality, that we don't say anything, that we just keep on trucking and worry about our own sphere of, influence and attack or defend, and don't try and help a fellow traveler with a very simple sentence could change their life at that moment.
Yeah. Well, and that is really what it's saying, is that at the points the silence becomes toxic because we are contributing to the idea that the best thing they can do is continue going down that path. It's interesting in sobriety, as you know, we are. I'll read something from the grapevine today that came in that Bill Wilson wrote. That he said, in the first 6 months of my own sobriety, I worked hard with many alcoholics. Not a one responded. Yet this helped me keep sober. Yet this work kept me sober. So the point, I'll make another point about that too, that's interesting, is that he was saying what he knew could help, but he wasn't saying it in a way that he thought required them to listen. He was starting to see that his basic function was maintaining his own sobriety so that he could be there for those that eventually listen. Whether they do immediately or not was irrelevant. If he's putting his best foot forward and becomes an example of somebody who's trying to do something for someone else without asking anything in return, and yet getting the abundance of that sobriety, then there's a kernel in that that's really important to notice. And the other point to his 6 months is that many of those guys that he did talk to that didn't respond ended up responding and getting sober for life. And for some reason, we don't talk about that very often. Those seeds, while they were underground and nobody noticed them, were planted. Because if we're speaking to insanity and trying to have insanity come to terms with rationality, we're becoming insane doing that, rather than simply say, we're doing what we can for those who are there, regardless of what they do in response to it. And that really speaks to this point that we are absolutely free to think whatever we want, including thoughts that are killing us, literally suicidal thoughts. Because nothing within the context of addiction is healthy. None of it.
Right. But I've definitely, going back, I've definitely been in many conversations, either casual at a coffee shop or in deep negotiations on a contract or something, that you see this person is thinking unreal thoughts or having a premise that's not based in reality, and you just you either walk away because you don't want to get involved, or you become silent, or you let them bully yourself into doing something. Like, I've never, only recently, I think, in my profession, been stopping and saying, no, that's, sorry, that's not real, or that's not correct.
Right.
That, let's take a step back here. But before, definitely, me personally, not at all interested in having this kind of conversation with somebody on a business level, personal level. Even as a father raising kids, I never thought about that, but now I do. I often tell my kids what they're thinking or their perception may not be aligned with, not in such, highfalutin terms, but just, maybe your thought isn't right now. Maybe you should take a break or take a different perspective on it. And, like, where before it never would cross my mind to say those words. So
Yeah.
the silence, I think, is a big component as we go get our $12 coffee and walk out up and over a homeless guy on the street. So our silence is deafening.
Well, and in the negotiation you're talking about and such, something I've learned is that I never have to tell anyone else they're unreasonable. I can simply tell them I'm not interested in doing that because I don't see it as any real advantage, and leave it at that. And again, the opportunity for you and I to have a communication that's actually heard by both parties comes from the freedom we have to make that judgment and that decision on our own, each of us. If we have the freedom to think whatever we want, I'm never going to convince anybody. As soon as I become a battering ram in the subtlest of ways, telling them what to think, how to think, or what they're thinking is wrong, I'm going to embolden their defenses, because they can't be thinking that without thinking it's right. They're not asking for what you think about what they're saying. They're telling you what they think because they think it's right.
So what do you
And
do?
that's, well, you just make clear that, like with a client, say, look, I don't work on that basis because it doesn't work and I'm not interested in doing that. And if you're actually interested in my help, I can't be compromised in the help I give because I don't want to do a job less than I'm capable of doing. And that's what you're technically asking me to do. So I won't do that. And people my sense is that we are all sane naturally, but we are operating mentally on a basis that isn't always aligned with reality. And so that's a huge advantage to know that. If we were all insane naturally and had to work towards sanity, so while we were insane, we weren't sane, you'd never be able to communicate anything to anybody. That's like, it's like trying to convince a turtle to do something else. You'd just be talking in such a foreign language. It would never even apply. There'd be no potential for connection in terms of communication. And that is one of the premises that occurred to me after I read the Course in Miracles. And it had slowly been unraveling, but the Course in Miracles very simply said, reality is real, period. It's the beginning of anything. Nothing else exists. Nothing else exists. So fantasy, while it exists, is fantasy. And imagination, while it exists, is imagination. And to think of those things in those simple terms can seem stupid. But the fact is, trying to think of them in all the other complicated terms we turn them into, trying to make sense of them, is the stupefaction of our own ability to stand on an absolute solid basis within our understanding. We're already on the basis. We already have it. We already know it. We wouldn't suffer if we weren't aware of what was wrong. The suffering would be common. It would be natural. It would be a high point, an achievement. And making that distinction shows it's kind of like our eyeball. We never see our own eye, and yet when we open our eyes, we expect to see. We know what they do, so we use them automatically. We know that gravity will be there. We don't question it. We don't even have to understand it. As a matter of fact, we don't understand it in physics, in all of its whatever they would be, terms or components.
Reality.
Yeah, we don't understand all the details. And yet we don't need to understand it to rely on it. And that's exactly what we're talking about. To think we need to understand it is to think that we are more powerful than it. Until we understand it, then it doesn't exist. Rather than start to say, well, man, this is just an if. This isn't a demand or a telling or you need to do this. This is just simply suggesting, if it is, that we each have the option and have had the option the whole time to choose to think aligned with how things are rather than how things are not. And to think things are not as they are and to think that's how they are is to not be thinking about things at all, but thinking about how we think of them as the exclusive dominating force. And that has been a human dilemma, a human problem, a human conflict, which has been exhibited in untold destructive, inhumane ways through history. That righteousness, that demanding, that idea that we are on God's side, but God is against everyone else but us.
What do you, sorry, what,
yeah.
That gets back to me of always like, you overhear a conversation at a coffee shop in the line. Like, do you say something? Do you not say something? Do you?
Well, that comment isn't to sort of, go out and stand on the street corner with a big sign and start yelling at everybody.
Just your everyday moving through space and time, you come across situations that you feel like you could step in and say, something, maybe you're thinking, even with any situation,
I do, and I don't always, but I don't always stand in front of people who seem to be in a crisis. And yet I know that whatever they're doing, most of my experience is just like in my own experience of what I do, is that I'm often putting on the best face and not walking around as an open wound when I'm actually suffering and struggling with things. There is an internal process that goes on that is important to maintain. But if I'm maintaining it as a hidden, if I'm thinking I shouldn't be talking about what I'm actually going through in all cases, you lose the value of being able to have people see that even in the insight I might be able to offer, or even in the thoughts I might have, that there is also a reckoning that I'm facing on a daily basis to some degree, and I would think to all degrees, that is constantly both challenged and developing in a direction that's either reinforcing the wrong that I think is right, or actually beginning to align with the light and the right that I know is absolutely true. So
Yeah.
that
How do you become that beacon, but not proselytize, attraction rather than promotion? How do you?
I just think you speak for your own experience and tell people that I've thought that before, but I have not found that to work very productive. And you're certainly free to whatever you think, but it may be worth looking at it a little closer. I've thought those thoughts and also had the conflicts that came with that kind of thinking. And just open the door. One of the things that hit me really hard after a breakup in a relationship, and I walked for a year from 5 o'clock in the morning from 6th and Flower to the Santa Monica Pier, 1 hour walk. And I just processed and processed and processed because I was upset, but I knew the upset was coming from some place that I had never resolved within my own experience. I knew that this had happened since the time Jackie Rose in 6th grade and called me at home and told me at dinner that she wanted to break up with me. We were going steady for like 24 hours and she wanted to break up, and I couldn't eat. There was something in me that got triggered that seemed to consume me about rejection and not getting what I wanted and all that stuff. So I took that walk. And two things occurred to me that were somewhat profound. The first one was starting to see that there was more going on than I ever think is going on. There's much more happening than what I'm thinking about. And part of that became obvious to me because I realized that if I'm having these somatic feelings, they must be connected to something I'm not spending a lot of time dealing with to be having them so consistently. And I realized I'd never addressed them. I've never really had them. I've never allowed them to be in my space. I've always tried to avoid them, to deny them, to run from them, to overcome them, to feel better about them and all that kind of stuff. So the one thought was, there's more going on than I think. There's always more happening than what I think, which was interesting because it started to help me see that there was a lot of thinking I was doing I didn't even think I was thinking. And then I began to say, oh, that's where the darkness comes from. That's where that sense of hauntingness comes from. That's where that ever-present seeming doubt, that reluctance, the insecurity, the vulnerability. I'm vulnerable to things I don't even think I have. And what greater vulnerability would I have than to deny things I'm doing that are impacting me and pretending they're not happening? I mean, it's another fantastic voyage I'm trying to set off and sail. And the other aspect of that was that I recognized that I could continue to love this woman and let her do exactly what she went back. She left a guy to be with me, and then she left me to go marry him. And I said, I can love her. I have no reason I can't love her. And I can have, and when I thought that, I knew that I could give her the freedom to do what she wanted. And I knew that I wanted her to have that freedom to do that. It was a whole shift in my awareness. And I started to see love as absolute and this well before I ever read the Course in Miracles, but the concept of love had always confused me because it always seemed contractual, which didn't seem very loving because it was, you do this and I'll do that. And if you don't, I hate you. That didn't seem very loving to me. It seemed like a hostage, negotiation with ransom involved. And if I didn't pay the ransom, I was constantly subject to some form of restriction or condemnation. But I hadn't found that with her. She's an incredible woman. So fast forward to today, Katie and I went to her brother's 65th birthday, who he invited us to, which was all family and the closest of friends. And her husband, Fee, who I call my husband-in-law, I love this guy. He met her when she was 18. Now, this is 40 years ago, maybe not quite, but close. And they were down in Guatemala at one of the Mayan or Incan ruins. And he met her there, lost touch with her, got back into LA, found her, started to have a relationship with her. And then all that stuff happened between. Then she eventually married him. Then she eventually divorced him, came to me and married me after I'd had that whole event. And that was interesting because after the point I had come to terms with the fact that I gave her the freedom, she called after a year and a half. She hadn't said a word. She called 2 weeks later and she said, "I'm struggling." And I said, "Well," she said, "Are you angry?" And I said, "No, I love you. I'm not angry at all." I said, you did what you did. You did what you needed to do. And I applaud you for that." So then we ended up getting married for about 2 months. And that was that.
Long
But I
term.
love him. His commitment to her has been undying. And I call him my husband-in-law because he's just a rock. He's been a rock in her favor. And, I was there with her mother, who's almost 90 now. And I had her to lunch, a year or two ago and just talked to her about the whole process and told her that I still felt like I was very much, I still loved Elizabeth. Katie and Elizabeth love each other, which is really beautiful to be in the midst of. They really appreciate each other a lot. And Elizabeth sees the benefits I get from Katie that I didn't get when I was with her, and she also sees the benefits with me now with her. And I mean, we've developed a relationship over these years that's strong, and she's an amazing woman. So I don't applaud me for doing that. I simply reckon with the fact that as I became honest about what I was doing, things started working in ways that were very symmetrical and very synchronous and very intimately connected, because I suspect that is the nature of our existence, that it isn't something I have to come to. It's something I am, and all I do by divesting myself of sanity is make believe that it's not happening. And then I have to hate people and reconstruct my whole attitude toward them to come up with some version of vengeance that will be sufficient to free me eventually. And it never is. It's just crazy. So I think we are all in a relationship with everything. And if we're not honest about the relationship we're having with everything at the most fundamental level, like making believe our thoughts create reality rather than simply manifest effects that can cause harm both in our own experience and others, we're on a path that's just going to lead into the continuation of this repetitive, brain numbing, body numbing cycle of making believe we have nothing to do with what's going on. And as a result, there's nothing we can do about it. So when you talk about talking to other people, there are things we can do and there are things we can say. And it will become obvious in my experience when I started noticing this probably 35 years ago. I started noticing that as soon as I had something to say that was really genuine and honest, there was a piece of my brain that would start sitting like with its hands on its hips saying, "Oh, you're an idiot. You can't say that." And I started saying, "Oh, that's that whole, I've created this whole complex, literally this complexity in my own thinking that I really believe, that I'm so vested in and so have so much belief in, that I really believe it's there. I really believe it's real." And so what I started doing was, rather than stop at those points, I continued. When I heard that roar inside start to say no, I would say, "Oh, that's telling me if I'm saying yes, because the insanity is saying no." That's the case. I have a better sense of that, and I can continue. And so many things happened as a result of that that seemed miraculous, but I realized aren't miraculous at all. They're actually just natural, almost intuitive things that occurred when I would say the thing that I thought I absolutely should never say. And then it opened this panoramic door up of opportunity that I never would have had I not said those simple words. And I can give you multiple examples of that in business, but I think the broad stroke may be enough for people to also notice in their own experience. I have another friend who struggled for a long time with his wife, and I said, "She doesn't respect you because you're not honest with her." And he said, "What do you mean? I try to do everything she wants." And I said, "Exactly. She knows you don't want to do everything she wants, and you're struggling to do it. That's dishonest to her. She's not stupid, so she doesn't trust you." And he said, "Well, what do I do?" I said, "Start to be honest. Tell her what you think. I don't want to do it. I don't like that." So 2 weeks later, he said, "She's never respected me more." And it's simple, but it doesn't. The convenience of making believe what we're doing is the right thing is sort of the convenience of making believe that hitting a joint or taking a line of Coke or having a drink is the right thing, because it gives us that immediate gratification. And my sense is this ability we have to make believe what we're thinking is right when it's wrong sets off a little dopamine and serotonin. All of the things that would be the same as an addiction get triggered in our body because we think that we're masters of the universe and but nothing can touch us. When in fact, we're intimately connected with everything that there is to not only touch, but to be moved by in invisible, untouchable ways as far as our fingers go, which is awe and inspiration.
So it's not like a proselytizing.
No.
I'm just trying to get, other people who may be listening to this, it's sort of practicing it on a daily basis in all situations.
Well, and the first situation is in your own experience, because we
Yeah,
really
yeah.
do. This idea that we have something to talk to that's a self is the primary relationship we have before all other selves. And if we're capable of making up an idea or a narrative that goes along with the thinking we do about our thinking, there's nothing wrong with that. It's like going to a play. You know it's going to end. You know the characters that are on the stage are acting out as characters. But you don't think when it's over, they're all dying.
Right.
And yet this narrative in us, my sense is it's why we think death is so horrifying, because we are horrified to let go of the ideas that we have lived with so long that seem to define us that aren't true. And we're so ashamed and guilty that's why guilt and shame are so common. We're actually guilty for that because there's nobody, if we each have the freedom to think what we want, there is nobody else that can think those things for us or tell us to think those things. So we can't tell anyone out there listening what to think. But I can mention that if we have the same basis as a species, there's probably a good chance we're doing what we think is unique to us is just the circumstances, the time and the place and the space and the forms that we have. That's the uniqueness, our own visual formed experience. But the reality of it, the basis of it is the same. The disturbing feelings, the upset, the anxiety, the stress. Everyone seems to share that to some degree. If that's the case, and if we're talking about the circumstances superficially as to how to map them out, then we're wrong about the basis of the thinking we're doing. We're never going to map it out wisely or sanely. It's always just going to be a patchwork quilt of repairs made on what we call a leaky boat. But in fact, like I said, it's already sunken at the bottom of the ocean. Because there is no reality in a lie. There is no reality in fantasy. The whole point of fantasy is that it isn't reality. It's just simply imagined. It doesn't mean we can't imagine reality. And that's ultimately, in my estimation, what thinking is designed to do, is to express intuition, which is defined as knowledge beyond reason, meaning it isn't reasonable. It's not logical. It's preposterous to the construction we have of limited ideas and the finite ideas we have. It's preposterous, absolutely impossible to those ideas. Of course it is, because they're not based on an infinite absolute nature. We're thinking of them as the exclusion of the infinite nature and the only thing we have to think about and the only thing that we are, which would make life seem impossible when in fact all we're witnessing is the impossibility of the thinking we're doing. And seeing now, you can see how that kind of projection all of a sudden engulfs all of life. We blame life for being complicated and hard when it is in fact the thinking we're doing about it that's causing that. It creates a lens of misperception.
Yeah. I see that. Yeah. People complaining, not to me, but just, my life is so hard. I'm so busy. I can't do the things I want to do. All this self BS.
Well, keep in mind, though, Gabe, and it's taken me some time to come to terms with this, is that if we're seeing it, we're doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the offensive things that we do is to think we're not. which then becomes this proselytize. I got to convince people to undo what they're doing because I'm so ashamed to admit either I'm doing it or I have the potential to do it or I've done it. In any way, I'm doing it to see them as wrong in some way. And what I've learned is that I used to hold people in contempt, and I say used to, I still do to hold people in contempt for all their silliness because it's so glaringly obvious. But to the degree I hold them in contempt, I think I'm not doing it anymore, rather than really see that connection. I have compassion for them when I see it as something I'm doing because the connection is connected. There's a passion there. There's an inspiration there. There's a connection that's absolutely, it's the basis of healing, the basis of camaraderie and community, literally communion, rather than, oh man, they're so sick and they're so off the wall. And boy, I wish I could get through to them and I'd correct them. But if I started with one, I'd have 8.5 billion left to do. If I begin to notice that the platform we all share is the same for everyone, it's not going to take long or much for everyone to start seeing things more clearly. And I'm not suggesting what we're talking about is that clarity, but I suspect it's a window into that clarity that people are capable of developing very quickly when they begin to concede the nature of nature is natural and it is our nature. And it includes everything that we can't even describe, which are all the things we think are nothing and yet exist. And to begin thinking that way again, sort of open doors to possibilities. When you think you're right about something, you think it's easy to think, oh, well, maybe there's more to this than I'm thinking. And you begin to get off the whole process of making thinking right or wrong and start noticing it's just a thought I'm having. And the point of the thinking is to make decisions that support my well-being and others. What's the best thing I can do, not just for me, but if I'm doing it principally, it's the best thing I can do for everyone because it's an easy thing to follow. People can say, oh, I watched that kid ride the bike, I can ride the bike. And with kids, that's often the case. They see another kid do something, they're like, I can do that. If the parent tells them to do it, they're like, go to hell, I can't do that. You're scaring me. I don't know how, all that stuff. That imposition seems to immediately create that resistance. And I suspect it's been going on so long that we think it's normal. And the fact is, if it is normal and killing us, it certainly doesn't align with the instinct of survival and abundance, thriving. So I would say that presumption is just that we've done it all along. And, again, we think it's the only thing we can continue doing. It's like we say the sun goes up and down, it doesn't. We talk in those terms because that's how things seem rather than how they actually are. We move toward the sun or we move away from it every day. And we're rotating on a planet. That's what's actually happening. So settling in tends to keep the impulse of thinking there's something you have to do in check. Because the first bit of freedom is noticing there's absolutely nothing you need to do because everything is already happening right now. What is there to do when everything that's happening is happening right now? Absolutely nothing. We're already doing it. But we don't have to do anything about it. And that freedom tends to allow for decisions that are based much more in responsiveness and the ability to respond, which is responsibility rather than reactivity and these sort of knee-jerk, quick fix solutions that we're constantly trying to patch things with. Some of the most valuable things you've said to me, Gabe, challenge what I'm doing because you offer me perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of the key. It's like you really have to not just take things at face value, especially with our warped perception as addicts, for sure. It's that it's, it's not always what it seems. I mean,
Well, then I would say if we take the things we are actually facing at face value, it's very simple. The problem is we keep thinking that the things we're facing that are complex are the only, we need to face those, and we think we need to continue to face them and create more and more complexity by imagining that they're actually even real, rather than begin to concede that it's a complete fraud to imagine that. And we feel like imposters imagining that. We feel like we're living a false life and fake and all that other kind of stuff because we're still giving it a seeming life that it doesn't even have, to think it's something we need to deal with. The ultimate conclusion is that it's just fantasy. And when you begin to concede it as such, it evaporates immediately. It's like waking up from a dream and being afraid. And you're like, oh, what a relief. It was a dream. We don't seem to do that in these daydreams that we perpetuate, because this all seems more real than a dream, when in fact, to be in those fantastic voyages is it's sleepwalking. It's no more than that. It's being in a hypnotic trance, as though what the hypnotist said is happening is the only thing happening. And we've literally hypnotized ourselves. We're in a trance, mesmerized, intoxicated by the thinking we do about our thinking, and we think more of it is going to solve it. But in fact, it's exactly what insanity would do, would think that less sanity is the goal and more insanity is the solution. Right? You seldom see people who are mentally ill say, who the hell am I talking to? And if you notice, especially in our neighborhoods where you have a lot of people on the street that are severely ill mentally because they're barely capable of speaking to another person and taking care of themselves, and yet they're surviving, which is really kind of indicative of something greater than the appearance that they promote. But I never hear them talk happily to whoever it is they're yelling at. They never seem to be having an open conversation when they're talking. And today it's easy to
remember that time and all that stuff.
They're yelling at somebody.
Yeah.
They're yelling at somebody who isn't there, and they're angry. They're hostile. It seems to be real. Well, how things seem isn't how things are. And if you and I, getting back to the silence, if you and I are getting better every day in some way, that alone, that presence alone is calming to people who are triggered by the reactive energy that we can create. That alone is helpful. Mark is back in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he was walking while I was talking to him, and some deers were in the yard. And I said, I said, are the fawns there? And he said, yeah. I said, notice the mother. Watch her, watch you. She's going to keep her eyes on you. And he said, oh yeah, she watches every move I make. They're very afraid of humans. They know to be. But as he stood there, the thing started approaching him. The deer. And my sense is, when you're I read something that some monk who'd go into the forest and meditate for 2 or 3 days, and people said, aren't you afraid of the animals? And I said, the animals just eat when they eat. They're not looking for something to eat all the time. And they're not always interested in everything that there is to eat. He said, so when I'm quiet, they're quiet too.
Yeah.
So the energy that we have conveys in ways that trigger people and cause them and reinforce it. And when I presume they're going to do something because that's the idea I have about them, I'm inevitably going to do what it takes to have that happen so that I can prove that thinking is right. I'm going to go to any length to try to prove that thinking is right.
What is that? I don't know. This is a divergence, but what does that come from? Where does that righteousness come from?
From the wrong we made believe was right. My sense is that if you put the pyramid upside down and think of all the things that we struggle with as getting greater and greater and greater as we struggle, the one single point is that our spirituality depends on some form of performance that we have to accomplish to earn it, to be worthy of it. And in the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at those transitions through history. And the original one was just clans, because of the nature of family being close, determined that their clan was unique to all other clans, and that God, whoever that God was they imagined, or the gods, sanctioned them as being the only clan, and as a result, they felt justified in defending against any other groups and clans. So they'd kill them because they saw them as a threat, because they knew they had the same possibility to think that way. And there's been probably a dozen or 15 other major transitions between, having to have faith in the church, then having to have faith at all, then having to have belief at all, then having to have works, then having faith and works together, and all these little qualifications constantly suggest that God in this infinite absolute state is a human who is as petty as we are and expects people to perform according to our dictates, or we hate him or don't want anything to do with him. So we're seeking mercy and we're seeking grace all the time as though it isn't natural. And why would we seek mercy if we weren't pitiful? Why would we seek mercy if we didn't see God as the hater of humans who don't behave and who's going to kill them? And when this is the giver of life, this is the provider of life, the creator of life, not the destroyer of life. And yet we've commonly held those gods we've thought of to be just like men, male, typically, though in many different, especially in the Indian culture, and they have female goddesses and so forth. And Chinese history has goddesses of different types, though their Zen is a little different because they don't think of God as God. They just think of it as this natural state of being that we talk about. It's somewhat different. And so the men are never here. They're always somewhere else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we feel abandoned. And yet if we're thinking thoughts that have no basis in reality, that would cause a feeling of abandonment because we've abandoned our senses just in the simple thinking we're doing. So to have a God we think of as being somewhere else that we need to get to, we have to die to get there. Well, maybe the dying we're talking about is the letting go. I suspect this is a lot of what Jesus talked about, was beginning to let go of the presumptions we have about God and the presumptions we have about who we are, and starting to see love and forgiveness as a natural state, because to have things as they are is to give them what they have. And that would even mean my experience. So forgiving would mean allowing things to be as they are. There's no unforgiveness in that because there's no collision with that. And my sense is that pinpoint that you're asking about is just this idea that because I can think it's true, it becomes true. I think I'm the creator of reality in all respects. Because it sets off this trigger in my body that is so intoxicating that I can have all kinds of drugs start to operate in me that are really designed to help protect me in emergencies, actual emergencies, from actual threats. And yet those actual threats are generally very, very short-lived. Anything I've ever been threatened by has not lasted more than 2 or 3 minutes. But this condition we create goes on 24 hours a day as long as we're thinking about it. So we're taxing our body to the point that our potential capacity to live longer would be easy if the bodies we had weren't under stress from the time we were born, because we are inheriting, coming in off of the history of everything that's happening. We walk into a society that's also filled with this, and there's something very wrong about that. And kids often very much sense that. They're troubled when they're young. Katie's niece, who's brilliant, cried for a year when she got here, literally. And in those near-death experiences, that thing on Netflix, the what was it called? Surviving Death, I think it is, something like that. Multiple people had experiences. One had her heart out of her chest in an operating room and was watching the operation from the ceiling. And the doctors sort of dismissed it all, and then she repeated everything he said. And he thought, oh, she was there. She heard everything. How could that have been? There's another guy, Bruce Grayson, from, I think, University of Virginia, who's who's basically one of the leading near-death experiences. A term didn't even happen until the 71 or 72. And I forgot the doctor's name that started it, but in the conception of it, they started noticing that through history, people who talked about that were considered insane, so they would isolate them. It's exactly what they did with alcoholics and drug addicts. They exiled them like lepers, condemned them, abandoned them, put them outside the city walls. There's nothing they could do with them. And so people in public service jobs were fired if they admitted having those experiences. So a lot of pilots and people who saw things wouldn't talk about it openly because the ramifications of it was excommunication, per se, being cut off.
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting because what they all seemed, even Dr. Grayson said the first time he had an experience, he was an apprentice, he was eating lunch, he got a page. At those times, the pager was how that worked. He rushed to the emergency room where a woman had been brought in who had overdosed. And her friend was there, so he took her down the hallway and said, what could she have taken? Is she doing any drugs? Does she know anybody with medication? Do you have any animals in the house that she may have taken something or got something that either they're digesting or not, whatever, anything, any possibility he's investigating. And they had a conversation and he went back and did what he could. And she came out of the coma the next day and he said, what do you think you took? Because they couldn't figure it out. And he said, I had a conversation with your friend. And she said, I know. He said, what do you mean you know? He said, I was there. I heard you. I heard everything you said. Hmm. And he said to her, he said in his brain, he thought, well, I'm a scientist now. And that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But if I'm really a scientist, I should consider that maybe there's something going on here beyond the limits of my thinking. And he said, if I'm really a scientist, I'm willing to explore this. Because he thought they made this up. They figured this out. This is like a magician who's come up with a plan. And they planned this. And that's how she knew what the girl said, because the girl told her in the beginning and they had this whole thing figured out. Mm-hmm. And he finally said, well, what if not? And then he started having more and more experiences with that. And now is, part of a NDE foundation that has thousands of documented experiences, a lot of them from military guys. People who were watching someone burn after an airplane caught on fire. And the guy realized as he was watching that it was him. And he survived. So if that awareness is something we need to be near death to finally admit, maybe talking about the fact that the thing we think we're so afraid of admitting, obviously those circumstances push people so far beyond the manufactured construct of an identity, this thing we call self, that all of a sudden they start noticing that there's something profound going on that would be unthinkable to that limited concept they have. But nobody seems to be darting back and forth with that self when they're in it, because the self doesn't even, they notice it doesn't even exist. And yet, I think two of the women said when they realized they were coming back into the body, they were not interested in going back, because they knew that that's where the problem was coming from. So my sense is, it's been going on so long, we really think it's the body and the brain, and we don't think it's anything more than that. We literally think thoughts intrude on us. You hear people talk about that. I have intrusive thoughts, as though the thoughts have a life of their own. We've given them a life in our thinking. We think it's who we are, and we think we can't do anything about it because they're independent of us, completely free. We're giving them the exact same attributes we have, that we're free to see and think whatever we want, and not noticing that we're using them, even in the terms we use about them, to feel condemned by them, while we've taken that same freedom to condemn our own experience by making believe that not only is my wrong right, but it's absolutely right. And now I have to work to defend it because that's what identifies me, and that's what specifies me, and that's what defines me. And we think our life is threatened by those thoughts. It isn't. It never will be. Nor do those thoughts have any life of their own whatsoever, any more than a mirror image has lungs, oxygen, blood, brain, thoughts at all. It's an image. Thoughts are an image of our projection, intention, our awareness. They're just thoughts. They're considering things. They're processing things. Their job is to do, thought's job is to process, compare, contrast, to analyze what's happening so that we get the best information from our senses. Our senses aren't thinking about what's going on. They're just raw data pouring in from our body into the brain. And if we're thinking rationally, we're making decisions that best serve not only us, but everyone else too. Because to think that the job I have is just to be the best I can be is to think it doesn't matter how bad my decisions affect everyone else. And that means I would be in a world with everyone else horrible, and I'm the only, that would not help me. I would be the only one that seems to be sane in the amongst of insanity, which would put me at greater risk. That isn't aligned with an idea of abundance and symmetry and synchronicity and the seeming communion that we all share that is so abundant as to still have us capable of sitting here right now after all that the universe has been through and all that the world has been through and our people. To be able to still consider these things freely right now is pretty profound in terms of not searching, but finding now. We can still contemplate that. The question I have is, isn't it interesting that we've been asking these questions for so long, searching for so long, never finding it because we think it's somewhere else and with something else and someone else rather than where we are now, where everyone is and everything is, always. So we can say we think we don't think we are our thoughts and still be thinking all we are is our thoughts. Because I can make that conclusion on the surface and still be having this perplexity of imagination running wild within my own experience that I haven't fully come to terms with. And if I do, wouldn't that put me on a profound level of thinking rather than this sort of dismal level of what thinking seems to be, this sort of destructive, people say, well, you're asking me not to think. And I'm saying, well, I don't think I've ever said that. I'm saying that thinking has a purpose that's much greater than making believe it is the creator of reality and then putting itself and pitting itself against all reality and think that fight can be won. That's how we've been operating. And my suspicion is that's the kernel. That's the trigger, that our thoughts are reality, and as a result, there are only reality, and as a result, there is no other reality. And just like an addict thinking that they have nothing to do with what they're doing, and so there's nothing they can do about what they're doing, and so they continue doing exactly what they're doing, thinking there's no other choice, is exactly what we're doing within that context of thinking.
Yeah, that's the kernel then.
Yeah. And it's a choice. It's literally a choice. The Course in Miracles says that the Big Bang was the first thought that we could be apart from God. So what did it blow into existence? Matter, space, time, dimension. All the things we seem to struggle with. Well, if our nature isn't any of those things, and we start introducing that to thinking rather than try to reinforce the thinking needs to get better about the sick things it's thinking to finally get to a place where it can think of being acceptable or worthy of God's grace and not needing mercy, because there would be nothing merciful about a God who isn't killing us, but is actually the abundance of life and infinite source, really beginning to look at the words infinite and absolute and unlimited and omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful, and start to see these words don't leave any room for any other power or knowing. There aren't exceptions, and there aren't all-knowing except one thought, and you can have that thought, we can have that thought, we have to develop that thought to become a part of all that. That would mean that thought is more powerful than everything, which would destroy the whole context of an infinite state. And yet we live with this absolute confidence that the finite world is all that there is, and not notice that the finite can only be defined within the context of something infinite. There would be no definition for finite. It would then be infinite. And I suspect the two are the same anyhow. So yes, in one respect, that wrong can be right, while it seems to be otherwise when we're thinking about it as life being only this form we're existing in, and only all we have is all that there is within the context of our five senses and the brain that we're using to the degree we're using it. Einstein said we probably use 5 or 6% of our brain's capacity. And I think he's really identifying the fact that we're relying so much about our thinking. We're imploding around the capacity we have and creating explosions as a result of the eventual pressure that builds up. And we're acting that way publicly. Socially, we've been doing that for thousands of years that we have recorded.
Yeah, it all comes back to our thoughts are truth and reality.
Bill defined an idea that came to Bill Wilson in Alcoholics Anonymous. For anyone listening who's not sober, it isn't required. So sobriety isn't a requirement for mental health, and mental illness isn't a requirement to have a compulsion. But my contention is that anyone thinking obsessive thoughts always has a compulsion to associate to them to try to bring some balance to their life. That's the attempt. I've got to escape into something I'm completely intoxicated with to try to bring balance to the imbalance I'm maintaining that's causing the intoxication. And it's all mental to begin with. But what he introduced was an idea of a God of our own understanding. And what's interesting about that historically is he didn't introduce it. Bill had fought hard and long for the identity to be the God of the day in the 30s, as they were defining God largely in the North Midwest. And somebody said, because the doctors said, look, people aren't going to listen to you. When you're speaking so much about that, you're going to turn them off immediately. And isn't it interesting that the one thing that could potentially be everything in the universe would be the one thing that offends us so quickly that we would turn off any more listening to do things that might save us from a drug or an alcohol case. And in those days, the alcoholics they were talking about were not kids at 15 years old who say, I can't drink. These guys were hardened 20, 30-year-old veterans of alcoholism, destroyed everything, lost homes, families, all that kind of stuff. Hopeless cases. They were not the subtle. Today we see people coming into sobriety because they recognize the insanity of their mentality. They don't have to have the bankruptcies and the divorces and the drunk driving and 18 years in prison for running somebody over in a crosswalk. All that stuff doesn't have to happen today. People are much more aware of it. But in those days, the definition of God was so restricted to what people thought God was, and people fought for that and still do today, that all the people around Bill said, if you do that, you're going to alienate the people you're trying to help. And one of the guys said, why don't we just let people decide what that God is, so that it isn't one for all, it's all for one. It isn't all for one, it's one for all. And that's how that concept developed. Now, that was a revolution and has been a pinnacle within AA, because it allows people who absolutely don't think of any God whatsoever and don't want anything to do with God because of the history we have given God by the choices we have made to make believe in God as this sort of human creature somewhere else who's haunting us because we're afraid we'll be killed if we don't behave properly, which is largely how God has been thought of through history, which is really a great definition of how humans operate. If you think of the way we've thought of God, it's exactly how we have thought of the authoritarian dictators, et cetera, through history. If you say anything out of order, you're going to be thrown in jail and killed. So that opened a huge door for people of all types, of all colors, of all races, of all persuasions, of all religions. Bill never said don't be religious. He said be quick to see religion as having something to say or to benefit us. I forget exactly how he says it, but don't hesitate maybe to see that what religion has to offer. Because the spirit is all there. We're looking for it in ways that confound it by thinking the ways we look for it are the only way. And the other thing is, if we think we're looking for it, we're actually immediately conceding that we think it's lost. And if something's infinite, it cannot be lost and it cannot be found, because neither would be possible. So the fear created over God is really the fear we're creating over our own choices to think in ways that have no basis in reality. And we are horrified for good reason, because our brains are based in sanity and have good reason to base that sanity in. We know when we're troubled that there's trouble brewing. And the degree to which we make believe it's not our thinking is the degree to which we don't adjust the thinking, but reinforce it and fight for it, and end up being so reactive over it that we will keep from dealing with people who challenge those thoughts and think that they're toxic, when it's the toxic thinking we're doing that's causing us to make believe it has nothing to do with us.
Yeah, that's another level of putting your head in the sand, is it's not me, or I'm a part enough or a part at all from, so I don't
Yeah.
affect.
Well, think of something infinite. You can't be apart from it. You can't be a part of it. You're just it. I mean, it isn't even, because it isn't a dimensional thing if we're dealing in the infinite. You know, from your physics understanding and all that, that infinite is often thought of as unending, something that goes on forever, which means if it's going on forever, at any given point, it's finite. So that's the forever concept, that forever never comes. So forever never comes. You can wait forever and you have forever to wait. That's a torture chamber. But a present state of awareness that isn't interruptible, it isn't debatable, it isn't violable, you can't change it. It has no, it's an absolute essence that doesn't change. It's the changing thinking we do about it that causes the distress and the conflicts and the inability to function in ways that are affluent, literally beginning to be fluent in abundance and in a capacity that goes well beyond our imagination, because we can't even imagine doing it when we're thinking about those thoughts as being the only thing that we think is real and true.
And for those listening, this still happens to me. Last week, I thought something was real and true. And in the old days, it would take me 3 days to get through that after panic attacks. But now it's, 3 minutes. It used to be 30, like, wait, what's really happening? The fear I'm feeling is because not something is going to happen, but I forgot to do something and I need to correct that action. Like the the fear and the uneasiness is because something uneasy occurred. it's
Well, and it's the uneasiness that's occurring that's always causing it. It's the interesting thing is to think of it as something that happened in the past, and to think then we're going to learn from the past and not notice that it's in the present that everything happens.
and be condemned by it.
Yeah, you end up being condemned by the idea that it's in the past, which is now being done in the present for something you think about in terms that has nothing to do with now. Even the circumstances you're giving it, you think you're learning from, when it's not that at all. It's the idea that it has a past to be in that confuses the present and say, oh, if I'm even if I thought I did it then, it's what I'm doing about it now that gives me the impression that I am either growing and more aware of it in my thinking, because thinking consciousness is different than this pure absolute knowing state that we have. And what we're doing is introducing this state to our consciousness. If we're fully realized and actualized in our human self, meaning the body, the brain, the actual self, not the one we think of as ourself, but the self that we actually are and share with everyone. I would imagine it is that pure consciousness. Then we're just introducing it. to a self that we've been thinking is only what we think, and we've been thinking more and more thinking would get us to that place that would finally be satisfying, which in my experience, everyone I know that worked for years to get someplace, when they get there, doesn't ever quite feel it's the place they wanted to be.
Yeah.
Because they've been every moment thinking of the goal is somewhere else rather than noticing the fulfillment of the goal to even be able to approach arriving at some other place and being happy. Time goes away when you start noticing the fulfillment of time isn't here anyhow in terms of anything other than a concept. But if you notice the fulfillment of the moment, because everything that's happening is happening, and we have everything intimately connected to us during any moment all the time, the fulfillment of that makes these ideas of going somewhere to get it become ridiculous. And start to notice that anywhere there is I go will not be greater than what I'm thinking now, because I'm actually creating the effects that are going to follow into that future that I think is somewhere else. I'll be creating a present state, because the future is always in the present and the past is always in the present. It's only what we think about the past that's happening. It's only what we think of the future that's happening now. But those thoughts don't mean that's what's going to happen or that's what did happen. They're just conveniences of making believe that somehow or another, again, we're going to be the rulers of the universe by coming to a conclusion. And then often wondering why our expectations are dashed. Because if I think my thoughts are real today, then I think they're the dictator of the future. And the only thing that should happen is what I thought. And when I get there, I'm collapsed over the idea that I'm not, because again, my thoughts have failed me. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it as life has failed me and all those other things, which isn't true.
Right.
So that present state, in coming to terms with it, we're coming to terms with it in our thoughts, not our being, not our knowing awareness. That's already intact. And that intact, peaceful, quiet state is what all knowing is for us as humans. It's an absolute stable place to make decisions from that are based in inspiration rather than desperation. As soon as I think that fundamental basis of my life is just what I think, and that life is only what I think it is, and that who I am is only what I think I am, then the basis of my thinking becomes this circular notion based on a thought that isn't true. And I keep trying to weave and weave and weave and weave the thread into creating a tapestry that's going to somehow take care of me in the future. When the present thought is insane, it's completely abnormal. It may be common and usual for us, but it's not normal because it attempts to defy sanity. And ironically, something that's absolute, you can defy it, you can agree with it, you can believe in it, you can have no faith in it. It doesn't change. And that's the nature of something absolute. It's perfectly whole all the time. Absolute. If that's our nature, it's probably worth talking about. And dispel the rumors that we otherwise continue to perpetuate and reinforce that help people get worse rather than allow them the chance to stop and say, oh, I don't understand this at all. And I say, yeah, of course you don't. Your understanding's been based on misunderstanding for decades, just like your perception's been based on misperception for decades. It might take a minute to come to terms with this and start to function on that basis. But the difference is, if it was insanity, if the goal was insanity, it would take forever to get to sanity. So it'll never happen. That again, the torture chamber. But the fact that our sanity is already here, even in the second step, came to believe that a power greater than ourself. What are we doing? We're going from the first step in pure subjectivity about what we're thinking about alcohol, which is I can control and enjoy it, with years and years of evidence that I can't. So I'm maintaining a lie. Second step is came to believe in a power greater than ourself. That could restore us to sanity. What's the restoration? But starting to see that beyond the limits of my thinking is the beginning of objectivity, which is the fact of subjectivity. Subjectivity and objectivity are simultaneously the same thing. I just choose to think that I'm an exclusion to the objectivity and end up suffering the thoughts that I think are my reality in this tiny little bubble of a world I think I've created. Doesn't mean objectivity isn't there. It means everything is beyond them. regardless, just like everything was beyond the horizon while people thought it was the edge of doom. My sense too, Gabe, is that when we do this together, and this is why I find in my writing it can be a little bit, it can be tricky to begin to put it together when I'm thinking about it alone rather than discussing it more publicly. And I suspect there's more I can do in my writing, and I suspect also that someone will come along and help in that regard who's good at that. That, you know, I can write, I cannot seem to organize it in a pattern that's sufficient or succinct enough to sort of lay this out so that it can be digested in a very general way and then looked at in a more comprehensive way as that digestion begins to take up the nutrients that might be available in it. And but the communication is the practice. The exercise is in communicating it. The exercise is in doing exactly what you ask. How do I get better at talking about this publicly? Because as I do, I can see the problem much clearer, and I can feel compassion for other people. And I can also see my inability to speak clear is great because I've never really done it. We're never in the moment we're in for any other time than the first time we're there, always. We're always facing things new. And the possibility of that moment means that everything possible is always possible where we are, regardless of the predisposition of ideas that we impinge on that moment and make believe that they are true, when in fact the moment still is readily available, allowing us every possibility possible. And to begin to digest those can be very daunting, to begin to think of the capacity we have and also the incapacity that we've been expressing. The lack of fulfillment of those things can be a little depressing to look at that and say, I've spent my life avoiding this. Makes no sense. Bingo. But since it's nature and natural, the fulfillment is always here too, to the degree that I'm not mired in the thoughts of regret, just like the book talks, and resentment and all those other ideas about how things should have been, could have been, may have been, but never are, because they are absolutely, whatever they were is exactly what is happening now, because they too have been a fundamental interaction with all that's ever happened. Whatever I've been involved in has been part of all that's ever happened, which is the sum total of everything I'm witnessing right now. So they're never back there somewhere. They're always here to be dealt with if there is anything here at all. And it's only what I'm thinking about those things that don't exist that's the problem. The present that I'm thinking about, or thinking in, or thinking of.
Right.
So that's the meditation. And it seems that people find something whenever they look and then think it's not there when they're not looking. And I would say that meditative state is this absolute pure knowing awareness. It's what we find when we look, it's there when we don't look too. And to start thinking in those terms is to start thinking in absolute terms and start seeing that things don't change, that are true and real when I think they change. They always stay the same. And so all that's changing is the thinking I'm doing. And I can start to give credit where due and say, oh, that's my influence here, which is decrepit if I'm thinking about things as real rather than it's just flexible and I can change that thought any moment, anytime, and get better at actually expressing that absolute, true, honest nature that is all of ours to share.
Off to the races.
Yeah, you know, another day in a row.
They keep
So I
coming.
preach. What's that?
They keep coming. They never
Hard as we
stop.
try to chase them away.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of one day at a time was brilliant because it's really addressing things the way they happen. We never get more than a day at a time. We never get more than a moment at a time. We're always in the present. We're always where we are. We're always with everything that's happening. We always have the full capacity we have, whatever that capacity is. We're always perfectly capable. We're always able. To whatever degree we're able, we're able. And whether we respond or react is a choice. And to see the reactions as definitive of the defenses is to start noticing that we're doing a lot of things we're not always fully aware that we're doing. We're aware of it, but we haven't been paying attention to it. We're aware of it because we've been distressed and disturbed and upset and turbulated and doubtful and feel vulnerable and weak. Those are all conditions created by the thinking we're doing that is doubtful and weak and vulnerable and has no basis in reality. The basis in reality it has is fantasy. And as fantasy, when fantasy becomes reality, that's a major shift and problem in thinking. Not to say we can't do it, because we're certainly capable of doing it. We certainly can do it, and we probably are doing it right now. But the fact that we think there's nothing we can do about it is the sick idea that comes from the idea we don't have anything to do with it. So the ultimate responsibility in beginning to claim that is saying, oh, I've been given a body. I'm responsible for what that body does and how I think and utilize that body. I am not that body, but I, like a car, have the potential to drive this safely and longer, depending on how well I maintain and manage it.
Or straight,
And if,
or straight into the ground.
Yeah, or just, never sit in it and think I can't drive it because it's running and I don't know how to press the buttons and the wheels and turn the steering wheel. That's also a possibility. It doesn't seem, most people who get cars seem to know how to drive them because they want to get someone. But the metaphor is the same. We've got this body of enormous functional capacity. Our brains are more powerful than the best computers on the planet. Our chemical factories are more developed than any laboratory on Earth, any pharmaceutical laboratory, any laboratory. More capable because our bodies know how to create chemicals relative to the situation we're in. They do it immediately all the time. If you take a bite of something, have you ever had really fresh juice and you get a stomach ache from drinking it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Especially orange or acid stuff.
So if you take a bite of that fruit before, 20 seconds before, you'll introduce the body to the chemicals that it will create. You'll introduce the body to the fruit and it will create chemicals to digest that. When you drink juice, which is something man-made, so it's totally pure, generally doesn't have any of the fiber in it. When you put it immediately in your stomach, the reason you feel full and kind of sick is because there's no enzymes or acids there to deal with it. You haven't given it the proper introduction to your body. So your body doesn't know what to do with it and it just sits there. And it can feel sick. So if you take a bite of an orange before you drink the orange juice, it will prepare your stomach for that juice. And again, most things that we are addicted to, most compulsions are all derivatives of nature that humans have had their hands on. Processed food is the more highly processed food is the most recent discovery in that regard. It creates a craving for it. Why? Because the body, when it thinks of it, when I think of that food, the body knows it's not going to satisfy it. So what does it want? More and more and more. It's trying to get some nutrition. But I'm feeding it the junk and the junk and the junk and the junk, and the body doesn't know what to do with it. So it just stores it as fat, all the other things that it can do with it, because it's really not part of its natural system. So every other thing, alcohol is distilled from carbohydrates and grains. If you eat those naturally, if you ate potatoes, you wouldn't get a hangover from vodka. You eat grapes, you're not going to get a wine hangover. Those are all things humans have done with it as reductions, synthesized, distilled, refined, concentrated derivatives of nature. And we're not always able to deal with those things because they aren't natural. They've had human hands on them. Heroin, if you eat a poppy in the field, it's not going to give you the same effect as when you start bleeding the poppy of its most stimulative or reactive compounds, whatever they might be. And same with cocaine. Cocaine, you can eat the leaves all day long and feel a light buzz like you would tea leaves, or drink coca tea and have the tea leaves. But when you put acid in it and break it down and get rid of everything natural and come up, or almost everything natural, but come up with the one stimulant in concentrated form, our body doesn't know how to deal with it. So it wants more and more and more. We subject it to that by making those choices and then wonder why our body can't deal with it and think by doing more it will solve the problem. It's exactly the same thing with the thinking. It comes from the thinking. If I think the sick thought is going to get better by thinking more about it, that's the insane thinking. Constantly just fueling more and more insanity because it's trying to survive. Just like survival dictates in healthy individuals, so too does disease work on the same way. Cancer wants to survive, and yet it kills the host that hosts it in the name of survival.
Right.
Because it's in plenty of other bodies. It's going to survive in some way. And the cancer is a great example. If you've ever listened to Zach Bush's description of cancer and how it lines up with how we act socially, it's really profound that the body starts going numb to the cancer cells and starts turning off all the stimulators to it, so it's not recognizing. Then it's exactly what we do in our thinking. I think if I don't feel good, I need to feel better, and then go numb to the no good that's telling me something I'm doing is no good, and it's always rooted in my thinking, since all actions, all outer actions, including feelings and words that I say, are coming initially from thought. Language comes from the brain. Pain is described or felt in the brain. It's not the toe we stub that hurts, it's the brain telling us it hurts, which is why it takes a second when you stub your toe to feel that pain. So, love you, brother. I appreciate this, and I thank you for the time you always offer and give. And, your insight's been really helpful, Gabe. And in talking about doing this on a personal level and developing a small team of people to do it in person, I like that idea a lot.
Yeah.
Because I think seeing eyes and sensing people in a closer, I don't think we don't have that when we're doing it via podcasts, for instance. I think we still have that telepathic communication, but like any distance tends to lessen the gravitational pull, there seems to be a lack of awareness of that pull, of the immediacy of that. Having people together often has an impact that can be much more tangible and much more tactile.
Yeah, and for those that are within the sound of our voices, we can be contacted directly and expand this conversation.
No, thank you. That is a point I've been meaning and wanting to make. And anyone listening, like I had said earlier about, Gabe and I do this because I want to get better at it. And I suffered as a kid, very, very troubled and very confused, and always did the wrong thing first, trying to feel better. And I realized when I first got drunk that the problem didn't start when I started drinking. I thought the problem went away when I started drinking because I felt better about the problem all of a sudden. When I got sober, I began to realize I thought not drinking, not doing drugs would be a panacea of abundance and everything would straighten out. But I began to see very quickly within 6 months that I still had this very serious mental problem. And it was now that I wasn't drinking, I wasn't using, I started having the capacity to notice that. So participation in the discussion is very, very helpful. And for our purposes, we've been listened to, I think, as of this morning, 1,030 cities around the world. And when you say within the sound of our voice, Gabe, we've been in 108 countries. So there are people listening from around the world that are certainly not speaking our language, but understand the language we're speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And the interaction that we are all capable of doing is profound. And any questions you have, any thoughts you have, there's a click through on the any of the platforms, Apple, Spotify, etc., to ask a question. There's a link there. You're also welcome to have these conversations with me or us, anyone I talk to, I think would be willing to have you included in them and start to participate with your thoughts and your questions and your circumstances so that we can address them. And also give other people listening the chance to see that these things that can seem distinct to you become very, very obvious for others too. The connection is that we're already connected. If we act like that and talk like that, the potential for that influence to begin to grow and develop reinforces each of our sanity in the space of creating a conversation that's actually consistent with sanity and reality, rather than reinforcing the ideas of how to feel better about what's wrong and work at more and more self-help when the self we're helping is nothing more than what we think. We're not getting to the focal point there, typically and often, but we can. And we'd like to invite you, as Gabe just said, to participate in any way you'd like. You're welcome again to send notes, and I will address them and share them with the local guys. And you don't have to give us your name. Anonymity is the source, the spiritual foundation of all the traditions, because anonymity is not just about hiding one's face from a stigma that may be hard to expose publicly, but noticing that the personalless, characterless essence of us is not based in a body. It's not based in the characteristics that we develop. It's based in an absolutely seamless reality that we all share. And that's ultimately what anonymity is a spiritual foundation. So operating on that basis would begin to reinforce that basis as something we understand and see, rather than think of it as something we need to find and get. So talking about it and sharing is, in fact, one of those ways to confirm it. Sobriety has long said that share, like Bill did in the quote I read earlier, that he spoke to people for 6 months and he didn't even notice that it kept him sober. His wife had to point out to him that regardless of his seeming failure and his own disillusion and not having had anyone take up his ideas or believe in his ideas or be interested in his ideas, she had to point out to him that he had stayed sober. He didn't see that until she mentioned it. The connection we have offers each other perspective, and the perspective we have offers each other insight into something that we all share in common that has no perspective whatsoever, because it's an absolute state we're always presently in now. Love y'all.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, thank you, Gabe, very much.
Yep. Talk soon.
See you around campus.
See you around campus. Bye.